Mr. Chairman, I think you're on mute.
Thanks. I wanted to thank everybody for being here tonight. We do have a quorum. I appreciate the attendance. We are going to talk about something a little different. In speaking with many of you, it's become clear that once we get past this educational period, we need more in-depth work and more ability to exchange back and forth in a dialogue process. So for that purpose, we're going to form 3 working groups. You will each get this in a written form after Monday. We've got a few more folks that need to review the official document. It's just a memo, but whatever. And the process is going to be set up so that we can investigate, understand, and have a dialogue on these issues, as opposed to what we've been through, which is fine, which is the educational phase. We're going to split into 3 groups. The first group will focus on what is the current CPS Energy rate making process. So we will have a few folks look at that, understand that in depth. For tonight, we're heavily emphasizing the rate study, which, as y'all know, after you've accumulated and understood the cost, you have to allocate those costs to class of customer. And so there's going to be a lot of work that needs to be done in that group to understand what CPS does and how they do it. The second group will study alternative processes that we've heard from Brattle and other folks about how different rate making processes can be proposed, and those will include things such as different types of billing for the rate itself. That group will get into the STEP program. That group will get into the housetop solar program, which is part of the STEP program. So that group will be kind of looking at alternatives to what I will call the CPS energy rate base case. And then a third group will be formed to understand the future generation and how we actually develop, grow, and modify the generation over time. And that will also play back into this first group, which is the rate case, because there's certain assumptions that have got to be made there. The working groups will be, 6 to 8 people. They will not be a requirement. If you are a member of the committee, you do not have to work on a working group. We'd like to see folks do that, because I think there's certainly, from the majority of the people I've talked to, a desire to ask questions, receive information, dialogue. There's certainly an interest in the public. And if we got to remember, our charge is to listen to the public, to incorporate the public's comments and understanding what their concerns are. And that's just not possible in a Zoom meeting of 21 people plus. So the working groups will be set up. Ann will be sending out with this a notice. We would like for each person that wants to participate in a working group to give us your ranking of the groups, group 1, 2, and 3. Those will be better described than I did it tonight. Those groups will meet twice a month. They'll meet on the 2nd and 4th Thursdays of each month, starting with September 9th. There will be 2 hours each. The first group will meet from 10 to noon. The second group will meet from 1 to 3. No food, don't come for the meal. And the third group will meet from 3 to 5. And then in between there, those meetings will be in person at the headquarters. They will also allow the public to be there to watch and to ask questions at the appropriate time. Do I have this exactly worked out as to how we will do this? No, but I'm sure we can make it work because I've got a lot of cooperation from everybody on the committee as well as the citizens. So we'll set the groups up. Please give us your choices if you choose to participate. If you don't worry. The decisions will not be made in the working groups. The decision will be made at the committee level, and information will be brought back to the committee. Now, we're proposing that the committee only meet once a month after we get through this educational phase in August, and that will be from 5:30 to 7:30 on the third Thursday of each month. Now, that will probably not be in person because of the increase in the problem with the Delta variant that we've obviously got here in this town. We'll watch that, but right now that will be on a Zoom basis, but will be after we've had discussions, certainly in person. So it should be doable. Hopefully, if we can get this pandemic under control, my preference would be to try to eventually go to in-person committee meetings. It's just too hard to do this. This is too complicated, and it's going to get very detailed pretty quick. When we send the email out, it'll probably be Monday. I would appreciate that if you could get back with Ann by the 13th of August. That'll be in the email to let us know which group you want to be on. If everybody decides they want to be on the rate committee, and there's their first choice, then obviously I'll be calling and talking to people, and because we need balanced groups, we need diverse individuals, and we need diverse opinions on each group. So we will try to work to accommodate your choice, but I'll be begging some people to go into some stuff that they might not be their first choice. So I'll get the knee pads on, and we'll get the committees established, and we'll have our first meetings on September 9th. Now, I know there's probably a lot of questions about that. So if you have questions, please don't hesitate to give me a call. You've all got my cell phone. If you don't, it's 210-488-3322. And I'll be happy to answer my best I can. We need to let Eloisa come back, look at this, make sure that she's okay with it, and then we'll get it out early next week, hopefully Monday. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chad, I guess. Ann, is that right?
Yes, sir. Chad's ready.
All right. Thank you, guys.
All right. Thanks, Reed. Welcome, everybody. Welcome back. I'm excited to be here tonight to talk to you again. Before I get going, I want to do a little bit of a look back. This is our 6th meeting. We've been meeting every 2 weeks since the end of May. That's a big deal. That's a lot of time spent with each other. Our first meeting was the kickoff here at our headquarters. Our second meeting had a little bit of Brattle talking and a little bit of CPS Energy folks talking. Our intention was to give you really just a high-level overview of the industry and the company. Then we spent the next 3 meetings, the last 6 weeks, with Brattle doing 95% of the talking. And that was intentional. We did that because we wanted an external industry expert to come and talk to you about how utilities do this stuff. I didn't want to be the one to talk to you about that because these guys are experts. They go and they do this everywhere many times a year. But now it's our turn. Tonight's conversation is going to be over cost of service, our cost of service, CPS Energy's cost of service, and how that relates to our rates. So thank you very much for your patience up until now. Tonight, I think, is going to be a really great conversation. Our Q&A is going to work the same way because that has worked really well the last couple of meetings. So I've got slides in the PowerPoint that are sort of forced pause points for us to look in the chat and see what questions have been asked. Actually, I open my chat window, make sure I'm watching this. So Ann Kennard is here, and she's going to help me make sure I see the questions, and we'll pause and answer them, okay? Okay, second slide, Adrian, please. Here's what we're going to talk about this evening. First, we'll spend some time summarizing just some background stuff about our current cost of service study. The bulk of it will be sharing the detailed results from our cost of service study, and then we'll review our current rates and how they relate to the cost stuff that I just told you about. Next slide. The agenda flows much the same way. It's the background and then some slides on the cost drivers, revenue versus cost by customer group, and then we'll talk about fixed and variable cost by customer group. I've got several slides on our current rates. Then I've got a slide on effective price and what that means and what that's good for. And then I'm actually going to end with, there's a slide at the very end that talks about what we'll do next time in 2 weeks when we get together. Okay, slide 4, please, Adrian. Okay, so Brattle spent a lot of time 2 weeks ago, Augie, who's on the phone today, spent a lot of time talking to you about what a cost of service study is. These are sort of my words. It's a deep dive into our costs, both electric and gas, and it's for a specific test year. We pick a year and we do the study on that year. Every single dollar that we spend that year is accounted for. And you can see, I'm not going to read the categories there, but every dollar we spend is accounted for through this process. Then we use a FERC system. FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They actually have a system that they publish, a process that they publish, a standard that they publish, that most utilities, if not all utilities, adhere to. It's a system of accounts, and the accounts are supposed to be populated with specific cost elements as utilities spend money. There's about 250 FERC accounts. One example is FERC account 364 is for poles, towers, and fixtures. So they each have a very specific, unique purpose. And as utilities spend money, their accounting organizations file it away in each of those accounts so that when a cost of service study is done, we can collect all the cost data. The cost data that we collected for our most recent cost of service was something like 20,000 rows of data. So it's a lot of information. We also then collect and spend a lot of time studying customer information, specifically customer usage information and demand information, and how many bills we send out to customers. Because with that information, we can then parse the costs. We can functionalize the costs. That's kind of step one, is we take and we functionalize the cost. That means by function, obviously, to generation, transmission, or distribution, and then we allocate it to specific customer groups. Next slide, Adrian. Now, part of what we do during this process is we spend a significant amount of time normalizing the study. What that means is we pick a year, but we don't want that year to be an anomaly, an outlier, something that doesn't represent steady state or a typical year. So we normalize. We normalize for weather. And when we do that, when this study was done, we used 30 years worth of weather to come up with an average weather. And we sort of restate usage based on that weather. We will also look at different cost buckets. And if there was something that was just an outlier for that specific year, we'll pull that out. We tend to use some averages for things like some of our capital expenditures. For this study, we used a 5-year average of certain types of capital expenditures, because again, you want this to be something that has some staying power. You want the study to actually have some shelf life to it. We typically will use our cost of service studies for 3 to 5 years. Our current cost of service study and everything that I'm going to show you tonight is based on our fiscal year that ended in 2017. Now, if I were to do a rate case today and we did not have a global pandemic over the last year and a half, we probably would have updated our cost of service. But that obviously has shifted customer usage patterns, and we want our rate making to be based on a relevant study. And so we very much think that this FY 2017 study is relevant and usable. And so everything I talk about tonight will be based on that study. The study is extremely complex. I don't know that I've ever seen an Excel file that has more stuff in it. And I have an expert on the phone with me tonight. Her name's Kimberly. And if y'all start asking me really complicated questions, I'm going to phone a friend and have her chime in. She's been with our company for well over 20 years. She is an expert in this stuff. She has a graduate degree in mathematics, so she can do math much faster and much more advanced than me. It really does take a lot of horsepower to be able to do these cost of service studies. And Kimberly manages about 100 different people over a 6-month period of time during the years when we do a cost of service study. Our most recent study, we completed in a year where we actually were partnering with Black & Veatch. Many of you have heard, maybe all of you have heard of Black & Veatch. They're another well-known utility industry consultant. We asked Black & Veatch to come in and validate how we did it and make sure that it was the way that other utilities do it, and then we basically had them double check our math. And so our cost of service study, we think, is a really high quality study that has enough shelf life to still be relevant to us. And everything that I've told you on the last 2 slides aligns with the processes that Brattle has gone over with you over the last several meetings, okay? Now, on the next page, we're going to pause for questions, but before we do, I got a couple of other comments, and I wish that I had thought about this when I was making the deck, because I would have put a slide in here. Ann and I had a phone call with Dr. Femi this morning. We've been promising that we would spend some time with him so that he could help me better understand a question he was asking. And in doing so, he kind of helped me have a light bulb moment. And it kind of based on semantics of what a cost of service study is versus, you know, what I think it is versus maybe what you think it is, and those might not be the same thing. So I want to kind of talk a little bit about what it is and what it isn't. The cost of service, it's a snapshot of our cost structure. It's backward looking, so it looks at a year that's already happened, and it's intended to study something specific. That's how customers contribute to the cost of serving them. We also will use it to inform rate design. Okay, now all those things sound straightforward, but let me tell you what it's not. It's not forward-looking. Obviously, if it's backward-looking, it can't be forward-looking. It does not calculate our revenue requirements. Now, I'm going to talk about what does in a minute. It's also not, at least by itself, an indicator of a need for a rate request. And it doesn't necessarily drive the price points that we put in our rates. So when I'm talking to you tonight about the cost of service, I don't want you to think, well, this is the study that we're going to use. It's from 2017, and they're going to use it in the coming months to do a rate case. Not exactly. We have another process for defining revenue requirements. That is our standard budgeting process, and we've got an FP&A team, a financial planning and analysis team, and we have a budgeting team, and they partner with every organization in the company. They do this, it takes a full year to do, and they're constantly working on it to do this budgeting process. Almost every month, we do a revenue forecast. The revenue forecast is just a P times Q. It's a price times quantity. So we look at our forecast for usage, and we multiply that times our current rate, and that gives us a revenue forecast. Then we compare that to this budgeting process. I call it a bottoms-up budgeting process. You know, they are out in the business talking to all the different departments to figure out what they think they need to spend to run our business into the future. When that process is all done, we compare the two. We compare the revenue forecast Part A, to the budget, Part B. And if A is less than B, right, if our revenue is less than what our budget says we need to run our business, well, we got two options. One option is we decrease our spend. We decrease our budget, and we go back and we say, do I really need to spend all of this money? And we have done that for the last 7 years. We've gone in and we've said, hey, okay, I can pull this out, I can pull that out, and I don't really need this extra revenue to run my business, and so we've made A equal to B, okay? Now, the other option, when A is less than B, when the revenue forecast is less than the budget, is to increase rates. And I'll tell you, in the coming weeks and months, we're going to be talking to you about that, because we've done a whole lot of decreasing spend, and at some point a utility can't keep decreasing spend. So that's the budgeting process, and when we get there, we will review all of that with you. We'll go into how the revenue requirements are put together. Okay, now I'm telling you all of this because I hear comments about, well, we want even more detail in the cost of service study. And I'm happy to share more detail in the cost of service study. This stuff really excites Kimberly and me and the folks on our teams, but I think it's going to put you to sleep. Okay, so what we've done is we've pulled out a certain level of detail, okay, which I think is going to be relevant and help you understand the cost structure in our business. And if it's not, if you're craving more detail, that's fine. We'll go back and we'll get more detail. But what you're going to see tonight, there are no revenue requirements in this deck. You're going to see the costs normalized from our cost of service study from 2017, and anywhere it says revenue, it is equal to those costs. Okay, so we've set them equal. The revenue from 2017 and the cost from 2017 in total are equal on every slide in this deck. Okay, there are no revenue requirements. There's nothing in this deck that says, hey, my cost structure is a whole lot higher than my current revenue, and so I need a rate case. That's not the purpose of this information. Okay, the information tonight is, how do we design the rates relative to our cost structure, and what does that look like for our different customer groups, and is it all fair and equitable and you know, streamlined and smooth across all of our different customer groups? Okay, so let me pause there on slide 6. Adrian, if you don't mind, we'll just kind of flip there, and we'll pause for questions if there are any. I don't see any in the chat yet.
Nope.
Okay, I'm not hearing any questions.
Let's go ahead.
Okay. All right, so slide 7, we incur cost based on how our customers use our system. Said another way, the customers drive cost based on how they use our system. On this page, there's 2 charts. One is for our residential customers, and the other is for all of our commercial customers kind of lumped together. And what's represented here is by month, for the same fiscal year that the cost of service study is based on, what is their load profile for that customer class? And it sort of makes sense. What you're seeing is that in the summer, that they hit a peak. Our system is designed to meet that peak for both residential and commercial. And their peaks generally coincide. I mean, they're generally in the summer together. But what you'll notice is different is that the residential customers dip much lower in what we call the shoulder months, not winter and not summer. It's in between the two. That's our industry term. We call them shoulder months. They dip lower, whereas our commercial customers, yeah, they decrease a little bit in the shoulder months, but not as much as the residential. This phenomenon, we call this load factor. That's our kind of fancy way of saying utilization. So let me give you an example that maybe can paint the picture for you. A few weeks ago, we talked about size of the pipe being like demand charges, and the water flowing through the pipe is like energy charges. And I gave you the example of I could fill my swimming pool with a garden hose or a 12-inch pipe. Well, load profile, or I'm sorry, load factor, or the utilization rate is how often I am utilizing the maximum capabilities of my asset, of my tool, right? So if I'm a customer that uses a garden hose to fill my pool and it takes 24 hours, and all I do is I turn on the water and I let it run for 24 hours, well, I'm pushing as much water as possible through that garden hose, and I'm doing it for 24 straight hours. So my utilization of that infrastructure is 100%, okay? Now, and the other example is this, oh, okay, I got neighbors coming over for a barbecue tonight and I want to be able to swim, so I'm going to pay the water utility in my little fictional example here to put in a 12-inch pipe so I can fill my pool in 5 minutes. All right, well, that's a whole lot of infrastructure for very little utilization of it, right? Over that same 24-hour period of time. That's load factor, that's utilization. And so what ends up happening is the fixed cost of my infrastructure gets spread over more units of the stuff that I'm selling, right? Because they're more efficiently using it. Okay, next slide, please. All right, the next 2 slides, I'm not going to spend much time on. I gave them to you because I keep hearing, well, we want more detail of what's in the cost of service study. But I don't think this is going to mean much to you. What's on this slide is one of the 80+ tabs in our cost of service Excel sheet that kind of rolls up and summarizes the sort of end result of all of this analysis. So you can see at the top, it's called the electric cost to serve by customer group. It's too tall, so I had to cut it in half and put it on 2 different slides. But also across that blue in the top, you can see RE, RA, PL, you see the total. Those are, well, it's the total, and it's our primary rate classes or customer groups. Going down the left is certain buckets of cost. Production, which is generation. There's some decommissioning, there's transmission, there's distribution. Within distribution, there's some subcategories that may sound familiar, substations, primary lines, secondary lines. And then all the way down, you've got some metering costs and some billing and customer costs. That's on the next slide. One of these columns in here classifies it as either demand, energy, customer costs. And then in the body of this table is dollars. It's just the numbers. This is the end result of us taking all of those FERC accounts and pivoting them around and rolling them up by different customer groups until we have this view. Now, I don't think this view is very helpful. It's just raw information. So what I've done is I've put together the next slide, which is slide 10. Adrian, let's just skip the next one. There we go, slide 10. Okay, I love this slide. And this slide has, one of the gentlemen on my team, Paul Escamilla, created this slide, and he did a fantastic job. This slide makes me happy, and it makes my team popular because a lot of people understand this slide. The top block of numbers is the normalized revenues from our fiscal year 2017 cost of service study. And the block of numbers below that, as it's labeled, is the cost to serve. And then going across the top of each block is the class for which the numbers, represent their costs. Residential, PL, LLP, ELP, SLP. Those last 4, the PL, that's and that's the cryptic letters that define that rate class. But the customer group is, you could think of it as small businesses. LLP, ELP, and SLP, collectively, I just think of them as large commercial and industrial. A data center, for example, would be an SLP customer. Now, down the left, for both revenues and costs, we've divided it into fixed costs and variable costs. And then within that, we've subdivided it between customer costs and demand-related fixed costs. Both of those are fixed. And then the energy costs, our fuel adjustment and regulatory adjustment, which are both cost trackers that we'll talk about in a little bit, and there's some slides in the appendix that better explain it. And both blocks of numbers, the revenue and the cost, have each of those subcategories, okay? The most important part on the slide is the last row of numbers underneath the cost of service. It says percent cost to serve. The way that's calculated is the bold total numbers of the revenues are divided into the bold total numbers of the cost to serve. So I divide, and these are shown in thousands, so you got to add another 3 zeros to the end of it. $1,032,301,000. That's underneath the residential subcategory on the revenues block of numbers, right? $1.032 billion of revenues. If I divide that into $1.091 billion of cost, I get 0.95 or 95%. What does that mean? That means my residential group of customers in my normalized test year, their revenue was only 95% of the cost of serving them, okay? Let's go to the next column. That's my small business customers, okay? That number, as you can see, is 109%, okay? And that's because it's 468 million divided into 429 million. And I'm not gonna say all the other numbers because y'all are smart folks and you can read 107, 107, 99, and the math it divides out. In total, if I were to do a weighted average of all of those percent cost to serve, the number would be 100%. Okay, so in total, in this analysis and everything you're going to see in this deck, the total revenue equals the total cost to serve. The value in doing it this way is we can see discrepancies between the classes. Okay? Okay, that was a big slide, and there's a lot on there. So let me pause there so you can advance it to slide 11, please, Adrian, and see if there's any questions or comments.
It looks like there's one question.
So Peter, I think this is the exact question you asked 2 weeks ago. Yes, the cost of service study is used to identify fairness, is what I would say. And that's the row of numbers on the prior slide, right? Is each class, is each customer group fairly contributing to the cost of serving them? If not, somebody has to pay for it. So if one under indexes, somebody has to over index so that on average we're right at 100%. Am I understanding your question correctly, Peter?
Chad, thanks for addressing the question. If you can hear me, yes,
I can.
looking at the classes, and you may be getting to this, but the customer classes, they break down according to businesses. But within the residential, and I know you're probably going to address this as far as the RE and the R.
RA,
EC,
yes.
Yeah, RA, and the different classes for the residential. I'm looking into that particular class. Do you break that class up, and is there a way to apply equity to that class versus just the classes you're showing right now, which involves also the small business, industrial, and so on?
Yes, that's a good question. We do look at it with subclasses within residential. The RCE rate that you're referring to is a very small group of customers that have specifically requested a demand meter. And so they don't actually have their own class in our study. RA is a legacy rate. It's RA, it's residential all electric. And what that means is they don't have natural gas service, so their heating and their cooling is electric. That's a rate that we don't sign new customers up on, and it's typically multifamily apartment dwellers that are on that rate. And once they move out of their premise and into another premise and somebody else comes into it, we take them off of that rate. So we don't have a ton of customers on there. We do have some, but for that reason, because they're all residential, we lump them together into a residential, you know, big class. And that really is akin to having different types of SLP customers or having different types of PL customers. Within PL, my small and medium business segment, I'll have a nail salon next to a Target, next to a Home Depot or a Marshall's. And, you know, they're different sizes of businesses, but they all kind of start out on that PL rate. And if they grow their load enough, then yeah, we'll graduate them to one of the higher rates. But it's not perfectly homogeneous within any of the rates.
So within the residential, just to clarify, there's no greater fixed rate that's set for that group like there is with the business industrial. It's the variable remains the same.
Yeah, I believe the fixed charges for RE and RA are both $8.75. So there's no difference between those two. RCE does have a demand charge. So that's a little bit different. Essentially, those RCE customers have chosen for us to measure and bill them in the way that we measure and bill a commercial customer, because these residential customers are very large users. I don't remember off the top of my head how many customers there are in this class, but it's maybe a dozen. I can't remember. It's not very many, and so that's not a rate that we use a lot.
Okay, that helps me understand, because I'm looking at the whole fixed rate question. If we're going to consider adding greater fixed rates to that group, and how that would impact those that would not have the energy efficiency, and then they would end up paying more toward their energy costs on the variable side, but not, but also pay more on the fixed, and that could be inequitable to those that don't do the energy efficiency because of their low income. So that was kind of what I was getting at with the equity and how you identify that group within the residential. That's what I was driving at, but I just wanted to make the point as to why I was asking the question. We can pursue that later as we get into the working group, so however we pursue that more so.
That's what I was going to say, is when we go into our revenue requirements and any potential, you know, recommended rate adjustments or rate redesigns, we will look at that. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, let's see, there's some additional questions in the chat, and I also see our CFO is chiming in, so trying to figure out which ones have been or have not been answered.
I think they've been answered. So Corey addressed that doesn't CPS also need to make a profit? Al made a comment that when a resident uses three-phase power, they are on a commercial rate, i.e. PL.
I don't believe so, no.
Okay.
But let's, you know what, Al, I don't want to tell you the wrong thing. I answered that a little quick. We'll write it down and we'll let you know.
I have one question, if this is a good time to ask.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, just going back to slide 7. And I know there's the utilization rate, you know, the load factor. That's something I'm sort of looking closely at because of that width of pipe and, you know, spreading costs over, you know, fewer or more kilowatt hours. Do those numbers, that is the roughly 40% and 61%, do they come close to what I would look at as an average divided by the peak on each of those graphs? Has anybody looked at that, or is it a different type of calculation that comes out to those rough numbers of 40% and 61%?
Well, here's how that works. I'm not sure if it's the peak divided by the average or the average divided by the peak, but here's how it does work. If my maximum usage as a residential customer, let's say one day in the month, my air conditioner and my refrigerator and my microwave and my dishwasher are all running at the exact same time, and I've got 10 kW of instantaneous power draw off of the system, that's my max, right? Let's say that's my peak. And CPS Energy has to design the wire coming into my house, the transformer, the wire going down to the substation, the transmission lines, and the generating unit all to meet my 10 kW, because when I use 10 kW, when I need it, I want it there. If I use 10 kW of power for 1 hour, that's 10 kilowatt hours. But let's say over the course of the month, most hours I'm using 5 kilowatt hours, or 5 kW, right? And I don't spike up to 10 kW except for maybe on the really hottest day. So the calculation is, if I used 10 kW every single 15-minute interval over the course of a month, I would have X number of kilowatt hours. That's my denominator below the line. My numerator is the actual kilowatt hours that I really did use. Okay, so said another way, if I use 1,000 kilowatt hours in a month, but my infrastructure is capable of serving me 4,000 kilowatt hours, if I use the same maximum amount every single minute of every single day, then my load factor is 25% and my utilization is 25%. Does that answer your question?
It does. It does. I can understand now. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Let's see what else we got here. Corey's answered that. Corey's answered this. Man, I need to keep Corey around. He's handy.
He is very handy. Yes. So.
All right. Let's see. He's not. He's going to be mad at me for making that comment, y'all.
I think the only one that we haven't answered more is Anita's, and I think we'll probably have to give back on that, her last part.
Okay, I think we've answered these questions. Let's move on.
Okay. All right. Now the next couple I'm going to go through pretty quick because really they're just graphical representations of what was on slide 10. This is just bar chart. So you can see the 0.95, that's equal to the 95% that was underneath the residential category. Small business was 109%, that's 1.09. And then all of those others, LLP, ELP, and SLP, if I merge them together, I think they were like 107, 107, and 99. So if I merge them together, they're 105. So that's what's that's what's represented by the bars. And then the addition of this chart, that there's the additional value that this chart has is the line that goes to the second y-axis on the right. It dimensionalizes the group's revenue. So residential, $1 billion, small business and commercial, roughly $500 million. But on average, over the whole thing, our system is getting 1.0. That ratio is 1.0. Adrian, go on to the next slide. Okay, so this is just the numbers on slide 10 on top of bars. I probably shouldn't have even included this, but this is just a visual representation so you can see who's above and who's below. Slide 14 is one I believe that we've seen before. These are what I call 100% stacked bar charts. Okay, so every line is 100, or every bar, excuse me, is 100%. The subcomponents, the stack, sums to 100%. But the comparative is what proportions are in revenue versus cost, okay? And so the more vibrant bars, the left bars, that's reality. That's the revenue that we get on our bill versus the actual cost of serving them. And so you can actually see this on slide 10. Residential, 7% fixed, 93% variable. That's their revenue versus the cost of serving them is 60/40. So Adrian, flip back to slide 10 real quick if you don't mind. Okay, and so you can see on the top block of numbers up there, $69 million of customer revenue, very little demand revenue because only RCE has demand charges. So the sum of that is 7% of the 1.032 billion, right? And all those energy charges comprise 93% of the 1.032 billion. And that's on the revenue side, and then you can see the numbers below. So that's how we get to the numbers on slide 14, the percentages on slide 14. You can actually go and do the math if you want to and double check my numbers. I promise you're not going to find a mistake. My team's pretty good. All right, let's see, go to slide 15. Okay, so this is our next pause for questions. Let's just scroll through here, see if we have any.
No, I think we're good.
Okay, we're all caught up?
Anyone? It would be good to be to reconstruct our rates for both residential and commercial?
Yes. Yes. They are both disconnected from their cost structure. And that right there is the riddle that, I think I said this last time, that's the riddle that every utility on the face of the earth is trying to solve. Because for 100 years, at least on the residential side, they've been paying higher kilowatt hour prices and very low monthly charges, and they're used to buying stuff like that. And so that's a hard thing. But yes, it will be good to restructure all of our classes of rates. Okay, let's keep on going then. The next three slides they do the math for the various cost components that make up the cost of service. So slide 16 is monthly customer costs. That's the first smaller category of fixed costs. Residential, you can see we got 710,000 customers at the time when this study was done. And we had 184 million in customer costs that through the cost of service process got allocated to residential. And you can actually see that number on slide 10 if you flip back, but Adrian, you don't have to flip back. That 184 number is back on that other slide too, okay? Now, if you do the math, I got 12 months and I got 710,000 customers that get, 12 months worth of bills. Each month, the monthly customer cost for residential is $21.60. However, in our rate, which we'll look at in just a minute, our residential customers pay an $8.75 monthly, what we call a service availability charge, but it's essentially a customer charge. What's in these costs is like billing costs and metering costs. It's the type of cost that we incur just for having you as a customer. That's why it's customer cost. It doesn't matter if you use a whole lot or a little, you're going to get a meter. And it doesn't matter if you have a high load factor or a low load factor, you're going to get a bill. Okay? Now, the customer costs per month go up as a customer gets bigger. Well, that's because we buy bigger meters for them, and we have more complex billing for those customers. And so that's why that scale works that way. Okay? Now, you flip to slide 17. This is demand costs. Okay, this is the bulk of the fixed costs. All right. Now, if you look at the residential line, 473 million. That's 473 million in infrastructure costs. This is basically assets that get allocated to the customers that utilize those assets, right? So what this is saying is residential uses a little more than half or they're responsible for creating a little more than half of all of my infrastructure costs. And that kind of makes sense because if, I don't have it in this deck, but if you look at, actually I think I do have a later slide, they're responsible for a little less than half of the usage. And that's just because they're less efficient. They're a little bit more than half the cost, but a little bit less than half of the kilowatt hours. But what I want to point out is that I've got NA for demand, and that's because we don't bill according to demand for residential customers, which means I don't calculate a demand cost per month. So where does that money go? Where do we collect that money? Well, we collect it in the variable charge, and I'll show you that in a moment. And you can see the other classes. These are, my commercial classes. They pay, somewhere between $10 and $13 on average per kW for their bills, right? And that's how we assess a fee to them for the fixed infrastructure that they utilize. Next slide, 18, is the same view, but it's for energy costs. And so you see at the top, 21.9 terawatt hours. A terawatt hour is a billion kilowatt hours. So what that means is we've sold, in this test year, when we normalized it, we sold 22 terawatt hours or 22 billion kilowatt hours. That always kind of blows my mind. Residential is a little less than half of that. And then, you can see how the cost allocated. In total, it was 476 million of variable costs to produce those kilowatt hours. And it gets spread across the different customer classes based on the number of kilowatt hours they each consumed. What's interesting is that the energy cost in the far right column, when you do this math and divide it out, every single class has the same variable cost per unit of electricity that they utilize per kilowatt hour. Now that number looks low because when we do this process, we pulled out the fuel adjustment because that kind of changes month in and month out. But once I include that, it's about 4.5 cents, 4 to 4.5 cents, sometimes it dips to 3.5 cents. That is the variable cost of producing a kilowatt hour. And we charge that to customers equally, regardless of which class they're in. Because when I generate a kilowatt hour, I'm not generating a kilowatt hour for a specific customer. I'm just generating it for any old customer that needs it at that point in time, okay? Okay, so those are the costs for those different categories that comes out of our cost of service study. Flip to slide 19, if you would. These are our current rates, all right? And there's a couple of things I want to point out. And I know it's small. I'm sorry, I should have used a little bigger font. Residential is there at the top. That's the first row. That, Peter, that's the RE rate, okay? Just for simplicity purposes, I just put the RE rate. That rate has an $8.75 monthly charge. It has no demand charges. The energy charges depend on the time of year. And so what you're seeing there is we actually have what we call a peak capacity charge that we assess during the summer to our residential customers. It's 1.9 something cents, and we add that to every kilowatt hour that's used after the first 600. So when it's not summer, in the months, there's 4 months we consider summer, June, July, August, September. Outside of those 4 months, every single kilowatt hour that they utilize, we charge them 6.91 cents plus the fuel and regulatory adjustment. In those 4 months during summer, the first 600 kilowatt hours they utilize during the month, they pay 6.91 cents for. But then everything over that, they end up paying 8.89 cents. And that's the sum of the 6.9 plus the peak capacity charge of about 1.96 cents. Okay, and so that is, it's kind of a modified inclining block structure that's only seasonal. Okay, so in the summer, we have a two-tiered, essentially, we have a two-tiered rate for our residential customers. Okay, and that's an incentive for them to conserve during the summer, right? Because if they're conserving, they put fewer demands on our system, hopefully. But here's the interesting thing. I think I've talked before about we design our system based on the maximum demands placed on the system, based on the maximum KW of demand placed on the system. But we don't bill residential customers based on their demand. So we have a conservation incentive that's built into the variable component of their bill only during the summer. Now it works pretty well, and it's a appropriate way of doing it, but it's not perfectly tied to how we incur cost, right? So we're incentivizing them to use fewer kilowatt hours, but we're not incentivizing them based on reducing their peak demand. And their peak demand is what's really responsible for creating the cost. Now, it just so happens that by reducing their peak demand, they reduce their kilowatt hours, and so this incentive works pretty well. But it's not the same incentive that we have for our other classes. So I won't go through every single one, but I do want to jump to the SLP because it's kind of the other end of the spectrum. And for reference, our residential bills are about $120, $110, $120 for electricity, just for the electricity piece. Our SLP customer, roughly the average is about $400,000 a month. Okay, so that's many, many times a residential bill. And for scale, we got, 700,000 plus, I think it's over 800,000 now, but at this time, 710,000 residential customers. We only have about 35 or 40 SLP accounts. Their monthly charge is $1,000. Okay, but if I go back a couple of slides, their customer cost allocation per month was $6,000. Now that sounds ridiculously like a whole lot of money. Well, that's because you and I are residential customers, and our bills are $110 a month. But if I'm paying a $400,000 bill every single month, $1,000 for a monthly charge, or even if I were to charge $6,000 for a monthly charge, it's not that big of a deal. But it does scale up. It doesn't scale up enough, but it scales up. Then I got demand charges. Now, here's another interesting aspect of this slide: summer and non-summer demand charges. Okay, so when a customer is placing demands on my system in the middle of summer, that's the demand that I have to design my entire system for all year long. All right, so you can see here that all of my commercial customers have a demand charge that is quite a bit higher in the summer. In fact, SLP's is roughly 50% higher in the summer than it is during the non-summer, right? It's like $15 versus $10. Okay, their energy charge over in this other column is 2.65 cents. Okay, that align, and that's without the fuel adjustment. That's pretty dang close to my variable cost of producing kilowatt hours, right? We saw on the prior page it was like 2.2 cents without the fuel adjustment and the cost trackers. What this means is, for my SLP customers, my rate is actually designed pretty dang well. Most of my fixed cost is being recovered from my fixed charges, my monthly charge and my demand charge. Most of my variable cost is being recovered from my variable component, the energy charge. So I wanted to compare and contrast there because I wanted to point out that those demand charges are seasonal, right? And that does provide an incentive to my customers, to my commercial customers, to curtail their usage during the summer. Okay, so that was a lot of numbers and a lot of talking. Let me pause there. Slide 20 is just our question and discussion. Let me pause there and see if there's other questions.
Nothing in the chat.
Nothing? Okay, yeah, it looks like Dee Dee's was the last comment.
Yep.
How are we doing on time? Okay, 6:30. Okay, all right, good. Well, let's keep rolling. Slide 21, I thought it would be helpful, and somebody gave me this idea, that it would be helpful just to show a bill. With all this kind of new knowledge that you have, it changes how you look at a bill. And that's the reason we bill this way. And people, I know it's confusing to customers. Before I worked in this industry, I thought, man, these bills are confusing, and they are. But we bill it a certain way because we incur costs a certain way, and maybe we need to change that. But when you scale down, or when you stroll down the fees on a residential bill, the service availability charge, so I'm about halfway down the page. This is a summer bill, by the way. It's an actual bill, too. We just redacted the customer number, so, for confidentiality reasons. The service availability charge is $8.75. Well, we just saw that on the prior page. The energy charge is all of their consumption, what we call consumption or usage, during the month, 2,235 total kilowatt hours times the 6.91 cents. Then all of those same kilowatt hours past the first 600, which happens to be 1635, are assessed an additional 1.98 cents. So we could write that another way and say 600 kilowatt hours times 6.91 cents and 1,635 kilowatt hours times 8.99 cents. And it'd be the same exact math. And I tell you that, and I do that little math for you because you got to view it that way to view this as an inclining block structure, which is what it is. Then you have the fuel adjustment and the regulatory adjustment that are variable cost trackers that apply to the entire 2,235 kilowatt hours for the month. And this just happened to be what our fuel adjustment was and our regulatory adjustment for the current month. The math works out, and the bill's $262 for, this was the month of July. That makes sense. That their last bill, as you can see at the top, was $187, $188 for June. And well, July is typically hotter than June, and so that kind of makes sense. That's a residential bill. Next page is an ELP bill, and you can see their previous month was a $74,000 bill. We got about 250 customers or accounts on the ELP rate. And those customers pay, on average, a $74,000 bill a month. I can't imagine getting that in my mailbox. The service availability charge is $1,000 a month, and that was on the prior slide. Then the demand charge comes in, right? So their demand, which was metered and billed actual demand of 1,617 kW, is multiplied by $11.40, and that is the summer demand charge. Okay, the non-summer demand charge is $8.75. Okay, but that's not what's charged in this month because it's a July bill. Right? Then they get their energy charges, and because some of their fixed costs are still recovered in the variable energy charges, their first certain amount of kilowatt hours is at a little bit of a higher price. That's the alternative to charging them more than $11.40 for the demand charge. Then they have the fuel, they have the regulatory adjustment, and it all adds up to $74,000. So anyway, I wanted to go through those two real quickly because I think, you know, based on all the stuff we've talked about, the bills, you view bills just a little bit differently than maybe you would have in the past. All right, so we're getting closer to the end. Hang with me another 20, 30 minutes.
You just have a question.
Oh, I got a question?
Can you better explain what goes in the fuel adjustment rate and the regulatory adjustment rate?
Sure. Fuel adjustment. We'll do fuel first. Fuel adjustment is the variable cost of, well, it's part of the variable cost of producing a kilowatt hour. Most of the variable cost of producing a kilowatt hour is its fuel. It's natural gas, or it's coal, or it's nuclear fuel at the nuclear plant, or it's the fee that we pay from our developers that own the solar farms that we purchase energy from. They sell us solar energy based on a per megawatt hour. Megawatt hour is 1,000 kilowatt hours. They charge us based on a megawatt hour basis. So that's a variable cost to us. So all that variable cost is lumped together, and it's weight averaged based on the percentage of generation of each type and the fuel cost of each type, and then this big old calculation. And Kimberly does it, the person that's on the phone with me, and it's her team, Zanette, they're responsible for doing this every single month. They do a calculation, and we adjust the fuel adjustment. That's kind of strange. We adjust the fuel adjustment every single month. And we do that because the commodity cost of natural gas and the commodity cost of coal, well, it ebbs and flows. And we want to pass that through to a customer almost in real time. I mean, it takes some truing up to do, but that's how we do that. And so if you think back to February when we had our winter storm event, and we were forced to pay exorbitant prices for natural gas just to be able to serve it to our customers so they could, you know, hopefully stay warm and keep things running. We paid ridiculous prices. We have not passed that through to customers in our fuel adjustment because we're still working on that. We'd like to reduce that, and we're working with our suppliers to do that. But I just wanted to point that out because that's a little bit different. That one's getting treated a little bit different. Regulatory adjustment is, well, they're basically ERCOT fees. And so transmission cost recovery is done a little bit different than distribution cost recovery. So transmission and distribution is like big pole, little pole. The big poles that you see around town and in the country when you're driving, those are transmission lines. The little poles, the wood poles and some of the smaller metal poles are distribution poles. And the voltages are different, and they're divided by a substation. Transmission lines, the state of Texas sets the process by which utilities recover the costs of their transmission systems, okay? And the reason for that is because transmission lines transcend community boundaries, okay? So we actually have some transmission lines, not a lot, but we have some transmission lines that are out of our service territory, okay? That's common across the state. And so the way the state allows cost recovery for transmission is every single transmission service provider, TSP, submits a cost of service study and a revenue requirement analysis to the Public Utility Commission of Texas, and the PUC staff analyzes it and blesses it and say, yep, this math is done correctly. And all of those revenue requirements get pooled together. The entire state has transmission revenue requirements of something like $4 billion every year. And it's just been increasing, but it's about $4 billion. That $4 billion is paid for by what we call loads. That means people using, right? And it's paid based on what we call the 4 CP, the 4 coincident peaks of the summer. ERCOT goes to every distribution service provider and measures their 4 CP. And so ERCOT looks at June and they say, okay, this 15-minute interval in June was the highest across the entire state out of all of the 15-minute intervals in June. So all of you utilities, distribution utilities, tell me what your system's load was during that 15-minute window. And that's one of the CPs. Then they do that in July, August, and September, and they average them. And then that becomes what we call the load share ratio, and each distribution facility or each distribution utility is responsible, their customers are responsible for paying that portion of the transmission system. So we say they pool them and socialize those costs. That's kind of the vernacular that we use. That plays itself out. That's actually a fixed cost, but we apply it on a per kilowatt hour basis for the same reasons that we apply other fixed costs on the per kilowatt hour basis. It's not ideal, but it's kind of what customers have always done for the last, paid for the last 100 years or so. So that's what regulatory is. It's transmission cost recovery. There's a few other small things in it, but it's primarily transmission cost recovery.
Chad, this is Reed. Can I break in here a minute?
Absolutely, sir.
So this fuel adjustment thing is way historical. Started in 73 or 4. There was a fixed number, and obviously the price of fuel was very low then. And primarily what this adjustment is the fuel cost, because of the fact that back in that period of time it was such a low number. And we all had to apply for an adjustment cost. So if people are confused about the fuel adjustment, just think about it as a fuel cost, because the base was so small at that time compared to today. It doesn't really matter. And so it's not an adjustment, it's really a fuel cost, if I could interject that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification, Reed. I should have said, sometimes when the cost of gasoline is really high, when you fly somewhere or you ship a package, you'll pay a fuel surcharge. A fuel surcharge is nothing but a cost tracker. They're just, hey, our cost went up because fuel's higher, so we got to pay a little bit more, so we're going to charge you that. That's basically what it is. It's just, we call it something different.
But in the 70s, we were talking cents per MMBTU, and it's not that today. So
yeah,
the adjustment is not really an adjustment. It's just an accounting of fuel charge.
Thanks for that clarification. All right, I know we got a couple of questions in here. I think, can you better explain what goes into fuel? Okay, that was Michael's.
Is there a fuel component to the energy charge?
Oh.
That was Michael Kennick's question.
Yeah, Michael, good follow-up question. Yes, there is. The fuel adjustment isn't all of the fuel. There's 1.464 something cents, this is defined on our tariffs, in that base energy charge for residential of 6.91 cents. There's about 1.5 cents of fuel that's recovered in there, and that doesn't change. The reason for that is because we see, well, okay, fuel costs are, well, they're about $30 a megawatt hour, $40 a megawatt hour. They don't really go below $15 a megawatt hour or 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour. So we put that in the base charge, and then as it ebbs and flows, we modulate the adjustment accordingly. Let's see, were there any other fuel questions while we're still on? I think that was it.
I think that's it, but Al has a question. Does CPS offer incentives to new large employers, i.e. COSA forgives their 14%?
Oh, Al, okay. Yes, but they do so in a very specific way. It's economic development. And so when a big customer, prospective customer comes to town, when somebody like, I don't know, Tesla is thinking about building a gigafactory here, and they have, 3 or 4 other sites picked out, they contact the city. They contact the folks that work for the city, and they have an economic development group, an economic development department, and they start negotiating, right? Because they want forgiveness on sales tax, they want forgiveness on property taxes, because they're going to bring jobs to the city. Well, they also reach out to the local electric utility and ask for a little bit of a discount because they're going to be bringing all of this incremental load. So we actually do have a tool. It's a rider that provides a temporary discount on the fixed costs to a customer that is really, really big, only if they have signed a big agreement with the city of San Antonio for economic development incentives. So said another way, I don't just give these on my own. I only give this very time-limited discount when the city of San Antonio tells me to. And it's time-limited. That's important because it's a temporary reduction in their contribution to fixed costs, but eventually they're going to start contributing to their fixed costs. Okay.
I think that's it.
I think we're good, huh?
Yep, I think so.
All right. Let's keep on going. Okay, slide 23. All right. So recently, there has been some conversation about fairness across our different customer groups. And what I hear is commercial customers pay a lower rate. When they say that, when I hear that, what is really being quoted is what I call effective price. And that's a common term in the pricing world, effective price. That is all of the bill, all of the fees and charges on a bill in total, divided by the number of units a customer utilizes and purchases, right? It's not really a price. It's just an average. It's an average cost per the number of units that they utilize, right? Commercial customers pay a lower effective price because of how they utilize our system, right? We've talked about that several times. The fixed costs of serving them get deferred over more kilowatt hours. And that's the whole entire reason why their effective price is lower. But their total bills are higher, and they're paying every penny and then some, as we saw, of their cost of service. And so on this page, what I'm showing is by the major customer classes, their effective price, the total bill divided by the number of kilowatt hours that they are purchasing in any given month. And next to it, I've laid out their utilization because that really illustrates the point. 10.8 cents, that's the highest. Well, that's because they have the lowest utilization, 40%. My biggest customers, my super large data centers, et cetera, on average, they're paying 6.7 cents in this period of time, this test year, 2017, fiscal year ending 2017. But their utilization is 74%. I mean, it's much higher. So when you think about it that way, all right, I got a bunch of fixed costs, and maybe my fixed cost of serving my larger customers is more, but they have so much higher utilization, load factor, that it just gets spread over a whole bunch of kilowatt hours. And optically, if you use effective price as a metric, it makes it look like we're not charging them enough, right? But that is not the case, as I showed you with the cost of service. And here's the other thing that I hear. Because the effective price is lower for our commercial customers, I hear people tell me, well, they're not incentivized to conserve. And I would argue that, yes, they are. Every single rate that CPS Energy has some type of conservation incentive. In our world, we call that a price signal. Every single rate has one. And I showed you that on that other slide, right? That the demand charges for my commercial customers are about 50% higher in the summer than they are in the winter, in the non-summer. Now, the energy charge doesn't change for my SLP customers, but I'm incentivizing them to lower my peak so I don't have to build as much infrastructure to serve them. but I'm doing it in a pure way with a demand charge. So it's just a different incentive, but there absolutely is an incentive. And that's an important distinction. That's an important thing to understand. All right, let's turn to the next slide. Okay. All right, so some more math. If you're not tired of math already, these numbers all tie back to slide 10. And then there's one reason why slide 10 is so popular. Residential, the blue side of this slide here. These numbers should be familiar. 1.09 billion is the cost to serve them. 1.03 billion is the revenue from them. 9.6 billion kilowatt hours, or 9.6 terawatt hours, was their usage during this test year. And so the effective pricing, if we want to calculate it, the cost of serving them is 11.4 cents, but the price they paid was that same 10.8 cents that was on the prior slide, right? So, yep, they're paying a higher per kilowatt hour effective price, but it's still not as high as their cost of serving those kilowatt hours. Then you take commercial industrial on the other side, $960 million of cost to serve versus 1.02 billion in revenue. Again, in total, kind of over-indexing their cost of serving them. You divide that by 12.2 billion kilowatt hours, or a little over 12 terawatt hours. The cost of serving them is 7.9 cents per kilowatt hour, but the effective price is 8.4 cents. So now that's all commercial and industrial. So like on the prior slide, it's PL all the way through SLP. It's 9.5 cents, 8.4, 7.6, 6.7, all weight averaged together. But you know, that it is what it is, right? It's all the commercial. You could look at this and go, well, they're paying 8.4 cents and residential paying 10.8 cents. We're giving commercial a lower price. Well, a lower effective price, which isn't a really good metric of assessing that, you got to look at their cost to serve. So that's another part of the story that I wanted to share. Let's see, go ahead and turn to page 25. This is a good slide to me because it kind of unpacks the cost elements and compares them to the rate elements, and it deconstructs the cost and then builds up the revenue so that you can see how they're disconnected, okay? So the blue, kind of light blue arrow bar at the top, this is residential. This is a residential customer. It's 184 million in customer costs. That's the same number that you saw on slide 10, 473 million in fixed costs or demand-related costs, and 435 million in variable costs or energy costs. Okay, so if I were to design a rate for them and it was sort of a pure rate, what would that look like? Well, let's do the customer cost first. 184 million divided by 8.5 million bills that I send out in this test year. That means I should charge $22 a month. That's the same $21.20, because it rounds to 22. $21.60 per month on slide 16. It just rounds to $22. So that's what I should be charging them in a base rate, a monthly fee. Now my demand charges are in A again, right? Because I don't have that part of my rate, so I didn't even bother filling in those numbers. So I got to get that 473 million from somewhere because it's not in a demand charge. Energy costs of 435 million. Well, if I divided 435 million by my 9.6 terawatt hours, my energy charge should be 4.5 cents. But it's not, because the actual average rate is 10 cents per kilowatt hour. And the reason that's more than twice what my cost-based rate per kilowatt hour should be is because it's also recovering that 473 million. Right, the 473 million plus the 435 million divided by all those 9.6 terawatt hours equals about 10 cents. And so that's why underneath that 10 cents in kind of the orange bar, that's the revenue. I'm getting 69 million in customer costs. I'm getting 963 million in variable charges on the bill. That's 7% and 93%, right? And then all that sums over to the left. I've already made the point that it's 95% cost of service. I'll just say that one more time. It's 95% cost of the service. And then on the commercial and industrial slide, that's the next one, slide 26. It's laid out the same way. So I won't, walk through every single number on the page, but even though there are, excuse me, even though there are demand charges, let me take a sip of water, everybody, hold on. Even though there are demand charges aren't fully what they should be, and that's because of PL, the small business class. They actually don't have demand charges either. We're recovering a bunch of fixed costs from them in the variable charges. And when I look at it all as one big bucket of commercial and industrial, I do that just for the simplicity. I'm not doing that to hide anything. It's the simplicity of showing you stuff that's rolled up. It ends up this way, right? So I'm getting 15 million in revenue towards my customer costs from my customer monthly charges. I'm getting 149 million in demand revenue from my demand charges. I'm getting 860 million in energy charges from all of my kilowatt hours. And in total, it sums on the right and then compares to the cost above. And that's, on average, that's the 106. So that's the cost of service and rates content that I had for this evening. And I'm going to pause here in a minute for questions, but I want to do a recap because tonight has some really important points to it, and I want to underscore them. And I'm probably going to write these down on paper and send them to y'all after this meeting, potentially. Point one, the cost of service that we just reviewed, it doesn't define our revenue requirements. We'll get to that. In fact, in the next, coming months, we'll look at our revenue requirements, and you will see that they are higher than the revenue that will be delivered by our rates. Second big point, customers drive cost into our system based on how they use our system. Now, all customers aren't created equally when it comes to how we incur cost of serving them. Our inefficient customers, like myself, a residential customer, we disproportionately create fixed costs, whereas our efficient customers make a much better use of that fixed cost infrastructure. Okay, next key point is my commercial customers pay more than their cost of service. I've kind of beaten that one, driven that one home, while my residential customers are under indexing their cost of service. This is relatively common with municipally owned utilities. And what we try to do is stay within a reasonable range. That range is about 10%. If we get outside of that window where one customer group is contributing, 90% or less of their cost of service, that's kind of the general rule amongst utilities, amongst municipally owned utilities at least. And that has to do with how we are owned by and are part of the community. That's different than an investor-owned utility that doesn't have roots in the community. They just operate some infrastructure. Okay, next key point, our rate designs don't align very well with our cost structure, and that is across the board. SLP rate is the best, but it still has some fixed costs being recovered in the variable charges. So we got some work to do there. And the last point that I want to kind of recap is that the effective price calculation, it's not a great indicator of fairness or equity, because our more efficient users will absolutely have a lower effective price, right? Because their fixed costs, the fixed charges on their bill get spread over more kilowatt hours, but they're contributing more than their cost of service. A lower effective price doesn't necessarily mean that there's no incentive to conserve. Every single rate, and we showed you that, every single rate we have includes some kind of price signal to be more efficient, whether it's a seasonal demand charge or a seasonal energy charge. Every single rate has that energy efficiency incentive built into it. Okay, those are the key points I wanted to make sure I recapped with y'all. But let's pause there. I guess we're on slide 27. Oh, Adrian, I never told you to go to slide 26. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, everybody. I was talking through these numbers on 26 when I was talking about commercial. That's my fault. 27 is sort of our stop sign slide. So let me pause there. This stuff is pretty complex. Are there questions?
Chad, I think I will echo your promise, as in I think I would probably hold you to it as well, to summarize those points in some type of communication to the members. Because I think I was actually going to ask you to do that in my question, but you've done that already. But I think it's nice to sort of probably drive some of those points home if you made that available to us in some written form that we can file away, instead of course, replaying the video. But I think it's really important that those summary points be made available to us, because as we go forward, I think we will be referring back to those insights and to those what I'll call take-home messages as we delve deeper into this rate making, rate design, and all the other discussions we'll be having.
We will do that. That's, it occurred to me earlier today while I was practicing that these were some of the key points, and I wish I had made a slide for it. So we'll put them down in a communication and get them out to everybody.
Great, thanks.
Other questions, comments, thoughts?
Chad, this is Reed. I think you've done a great job. You've got us through a lot of questions here and a lot of detail. So I would really appreciate, I really do appreciate everything you did. And if we could, now I guess we're a little bit early, but if anyone has any questions, please bring them up. And remember that we're going to start the working groups, and in that we can delve more into detail. You've got to remember, Chad's worked on the middle step of this, and it's a very important step. But we've got other steps that have to happen, and we have other things to understand. I see there's a question here from Ann Ledbetter, so let's turn it over to her.
Hi, thank you so much. I guess, more of a comment first. Thank you so much, Chad. It was a fantastic presentation. I think you did a really great job of, educating us on kind of the nuts and bolts of this. I think that there were some very key points that were made today, especially talking about, how the different groups pay what percentage of their cost of service, and how the rates are kind of split up. And I guess I was, one of the things that I've been thinking throughout this process is, and given that I appreciate very much the transparency that y'all are providing for us and about CPS specifically, but kind of my comment is this: I feel like more people want to understand this, but obviously it's such a complex subject. Now, Femi made a really good point just on the last few slides about, hey, can you kind of, bulletize this in a way and kind of send it out to the members? I guess my thought is, even if it came down something like a flow chart or, one of those like little animated videos, I really wish it were possible to kind of give the high points, the nuts and the bolts, about how rates are put together as a popular piece for the community to understand. Because, the more and more I learn about it, the more transparent things seem. And I do feel like, again, it would just be something I think the community would be interested in. It's just a thought I had, during this process.
Well, Ann, that's a very good comment. We will we'll take that up in the working groups. There's also a question from Jim. Will a CPS person lead the discussions? The working groups will continue to be led by Eloisa and I, and we'll continue to get the great support from CPS. So you're absolutely right. We will try to follow this through in the working groups. it is a complicated process, but in the end, it's only 3 steps. Figure your cost, figure out who's going to pay it, figure out how they're going to pay it. So we will spend a lot of time on that. And obviously the allocations are very important on that middle step. I think Chad did a wonderful job of explaining that today. We've got more time to get into it. So hopefully I'll get some really strong candidates and committee members into that first group that will continue to drive into these questions. And that's what we're going to try to do in September. Next week, I know Chad has some ideas and he's looking at some concepts, but in line with what we've talked about. Remember, we talked mostly today about the center part of this is how you allocate the cost. We still have to talk about qualifying costs, making sure they're reasonable, and then we have to talk about how we define and develop our rates themselves. How do those produce the right feedback loops so that we do accomplish what we want to do? There's a lot for us to do. Chad's done a great job today. And I think at this point, if we could, a little early, unless there's other questions, let's move on to the citizens to be heard. Unless Chad has something else to add.
Yeah, well, we have a couple of minutes, and there's one more question in the chat, and then I was going to talk for just a couple of minutes on what we're thinking for the next meeting. So Michael's question is, when are the residential smart meters going to be able to record demand? I believe they already can. And we may not be fully set up to bill according to demand. That's a systematic change that we can make. But the smart meters, I mean, that's one reason to have them, is because they have some advanced capabilities.
Let me make a point, because Michael has brought up a very important point. Technology is going to be huge in us solving these problems. And we all saw this during the winter storm. If you've got a smart thermostat that works off of Wi-Fi and you have no electricity, it's not going to work. So we're going to delve into that with this group, what I call group 2, which is how do we deal with alternatives to the current situation. So I'm hopeful that I'll get good participation. We'll get good participation in these working groups, because I think we all have a lot of things to learn and understand.
Okay, thanks, Reed. That's helpful, and that's valuable comments. So quickly, Adrian, if you'll turn to slide 28. What I tried to do, this one, thank you. What we tried to do tonight was get through all of the cost stuff and rate stuff so that we could sort of reserve next time for some of the hot topics, some of the more controversial topics that we've heard y'all ask about. So we're going to do some deep dives. We'll have affordability conversation. We want to talk about our existing customer assistance programs and community programs and the participation rates in those, and the type and amount and magnitude of assistance that they provide. And in that one, we'll talk about things like energy burden. That's a phrase that has been brought up over the last couple of months. We're also going to talk about renewable rates and cost shifting, because everything that we talked about tonight with fixed cost versus variable cost, well, okay, it's one thing to have rates that are designed and structured, in a different way than they cost, but why does that matter? That matters when somebody's not using the amount of kilowatt hours that we thought they were going to when we designed the rate. Okay, so we're going to get into that, and that's a really interesting, fascinating topic. We'll talk about energy efficiency and the usage levels in San Antonio, because one of the things that we've heard over the last 9 months is that, well, usage levels in San Antonio are so much higher than they are in Austin, for example, and that means we're not doing enough on the energy efficiency front. And the punchline of this conversation, I'll give you a little window into that, is there's other stuff that creates a lower usage level in Austin, like a whole lot more apartments and much younger housing stock. Right? We got old buildings here, and we have a not enough apartments. And so, yeah, of course, our average utilization is going to be higher, but I'll prove that to you and we'll show you next time. We'll talk a little bit about the benefits of the market structure because we get a whole lot of benefit out of being a municipally owned utility, and sometimes customers that aren't knee deep in the industry, they don't understand the amount of benefit. But trust me, I moved here from Dallas about 5 or 6 years ago, and that is not a municipally owned utility. And the utility I was working for up there, we were charging, and it was my fault, I was the director of pricing, but we were charging a lot higher prices to our customers than what CPS Energy charges down here. So there's benefits to that market structure. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then, of course, if you have questions, any other topics as time permits. Yeah, that's kind of it. That's the topics for next time.
Well, Chad, I think next week will be a very good period for discussion. And this will be our last educational program. So I hope everyone will understand that we'll have plenty of time next week to ask questions, to present their concerns, and we'll hopefully start our discussions. Because I believe that ultimately we've got to sit down almost face to face to solve these problems. And hopefully we can get these working groups going. I really appreciate anybody's participation in this. And Chad, I want to thank you for a very good job tonight. And I think we are maybe a few minutes early, but I would like to hear if we can get the citizens online.
I think we can, Reed. I believe they're both online. So, Adrian, if we can start with Dr. McGuire, if you will unmute her, please.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. Dr. Meredith McGuire, you will be unmuted now to provide your comments.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, hold on just a second. I have to get my paperwork in front of me. Okay, hi. I'm very concerned that CPS Energy's rate structure is extremely unfair to most residential ratepayers and to many commercial ratepayers. Keep in mind that this unfair rate structure is part of the reason that so many ratepayers are about to have their electricity shut off. It is important for the CPS board and especially the city council to insist upon a rate structure that prioritizes the people of San Antonio who are suffering greatly due to this injustice. Here's why the use of cost of service analysis to set the new rates and rate structure is so unfair. First, the division of customer classes deliberately obscures important patterns of usage, resulting in charging far more to residential customers and also to some commercial customers. I'm sorry, I already lost my place here. CPS slide number 7 tonight exemplifies how this is unfair to residential customers. It is true that residential load profile is far more uneven. The reason is because residential usage is tied to schedules that residents can't control, such as when they go to work or go to school, when they need to be home and cook and eat. There's so many businesses that also have similar patterns, but the classification that CPS is using is arbitrary. There is no way of taking a look at what the classes have in common. If you were to take a look at all of the places in San Antonio where they involve people eating and sleeping and occupying their rooms and having the air conditioning on or the heating on higher, those are all the kinds of businesses that should have the same kinds of concerns. Now, why should that be held against them? I realize that the load is a factor, but it's nowhere near as important. And you've ended up on a number of these things, basically combining the commercial, the industrial, everything. It ends up being residential ratepayers versus everything else. And that is precisely what's unfair to residential customers. The cost of service is based heavily upon averages. Several of the graphs in CPS slides compare the average of all residential ratepayers with the averages of all other kinds of ratepayers. Those averages conceal huge differences between customers. For example, a few months ago, CPS showed its Board of Trustees a graph comparing residential ratepayers' average monthly bill with the average monthly bill of commercial and industrial ratepayers, and that latter was all combined, everything from the smallest commercial to the heaviest industrial user. The banner on that slide proclaimed that, quote, on average, businesses pay a much higher monthly bill, 10 times more, in parentheses it says, than the residential customers. The residential average was $141, while the commercial and industrial average bill was $1,508. Well, guess what? Of course, the reason that there was a difference was that the other classes were using so much more electricity. Many of them were using many hundreds of thousands of times as much usage. So why would CPS present this misleading slide to their board? I suggest that they're showing you equally misleading slides for this committee. It's important to note that the tiny note at the bottom of the slide that they presented to the Board of Trustees says that the residential bill is based upon the 12 months ending in August 2020, 6 months of which were affected by the growing COVID pandemic. The commercial and industrial bills, however, were based on the 2017 bills, and they're basically comparing two completely different years, and that's a no-no in statistical analysis. So why didn't CPS compare 2019 for both graphs? My hunch is that CPS deliberately picked a high-cost combo for the residential and a low-cost year for the non-residential. That ends up deliberately hurting the residential ratepayers. Keep in mind that CPS's rates are also unfair to most residents, because simply by using averages for rate setting overcharges the residential and commercial customers that conserve electricity and try to invest in energy efficient equipment. They are forced into subsidizing the heavy users in their class, many of which waste electricity. Probably 2/3 or even 3/4 of residential and commercial customers are using less than the average for that class, far less than the average for that class. So think about those RCE residential ratepayers who are the heaviest users in the residential class. Many of those ratepayers are using 7,000 or more kilowatt hours a month, roughly 7 times as much kilowatt hours as the average usage of all residential ratepayers. But even worse, the RCE rate reduces the cost per kilowatt hour for those heaviest users. So there is no incentive for those users to invest in more efficient, for example, HVAC. But the RCE rate reduces the cost per kilowatt hour, so there's no incentive for those customers to reduce their usage or to not live in such a big house. There are some people in San Antonio that are living in 23,000 square feet houses, and you better believe that they're among the ones who ought to be paying that rate, but they ought to be paying the full price. CPS Energy's existing rate structure fails to provide energy equity because it bases the residential and commercial volumetric prices on average amounts of the usage. Since the customers that use the least amount of kilowatt hours greatly outnumber the customers that use more than the average, most ratepayers are overburdened by that flat price per kilowatt hour. CPS Energy's existing rate structure fails to provide energy equity. I have a feeling I just said this. They outnumber the customers who use more than average. I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself. I really think that there needs to be a serious question about the whole thing about the rate classification, because in many respects, it is the ratepayers, the residential ratepayers, who are the ones who need the affordable rates as much as possible. They are the ones who are struggling, many of them struggling to keep up with their bills even before the COVID mess. And think about all those businesses that got attracted to San Antonio for the cheap energy, and the fact that they aren't necessarily hiring any new people, or the people that they hire may not even be getting a good wage. So we've got a big problem in this city, and I think that it's really important to get away from the average. And I think that the kinds of a rate structure, such as the one that Braddock was talking about, having a lot of very precise ways of having each customer's rates be based upon what they have chosen to do. And I think that this lumping whole big globs of things together and saying, see, we've taken care of it, forget it. Using the averages is very, very, very unfair to people who are trying to conserve energy and trying to use it wisely. So I hope that you will look at those alternative rate structures much better than the ones that that CPS is currently using. Very bad rate structure, and the whole cost of service process is really bad because it's always backwards looking. And so here you have people trying to figure out how to plan for the future, how to pay for things for the future, when we cannot possibly know what kinds of rate issues are going to be involved with the changing weather. And the idea of having a backwards looking rate structuring rather than finding a way to have a forward looking one that much more carefully protects the needs of families who aren't making enough money to live on. So I'm going to stop at that. I have got some other suggestions for you all, and I can assure you I will talk about some of them at the meeting talking about affordability. But right now, I don't think that it is good for anything in San Antonio to keep the current rate structure. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. We'll move on to Dr. Terry Burns. Dr. Terry Burns, you'll be unmuted now to provide your comments.
Hi, thank you. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, sir, we can.
Great. Yes, I thank the committee and its chairpersons for their work, and Chad for his interesting presentation. I have several critiques, I guess I would say, regarding the data presented. First of all, I would say that the use of 2017 data is unacceptable. I mean, you're talking about 5 years. We're in fiscal 22 now. You're talking about 5-year-old data, and that makes it largely unusable for the current and future. Secondly, I don't accept the idea that this is such a complicated process to put these data together that it just can't be done for 2019 data. Clearly, every month it was mentioned, you update, revenue projections and billing and all of these factors that are important to the business. This should be equally important to the business and should be updated in a similarly timely manner. This committee should get current and useful data, not data that's ancient at this point. Next, I would comment that, yes, the difference between residential load profile and industrial load profile shows great variability on the residential side especially. And again, this is where demand management and efficiency measures, battery storage, all of these new technologies can really make a huge difference. Chad mentioned at one point about one of the reasons San Antonio has one of the highest per capita energy uses in the country, actually, is because of our housing stock. And that's absolutely correct. However, the efforts by groups like Sierra Club that I've been part of to really expand our tiny weatherization efforts in this community to something really substantial are not getting anywhere. Yes, we have a huge demand and we have a tiny response. And this response needs to bring together the county, the city, the CPS, and have a major impact on our housing stock in this city, which will be great for winter and summer energy use, water efficiency, placement of solar panels on top of houses, exorbitant bills that people currently are having to pay because they live in these inefficient homes. And these are all ways that we could make a huge difference right now on our current generation needs, as opposed to building another coal plant or some ridiculous idea, gas plant. And there are ways that we could employ many people, jobs on the ground right here, and make a huge impact on the people living in this community. So there really needs to be a great deal of work to change this mindset and our priorities. Next, I would comment that on this business about classes of service, I haven't found anywhere in the presentation a slide showing definitions of all of these different classes. I've seen bits and pieces of them, but I would echo the comments about the irregularity of these classes. I'll say that, how these are defined and who falls into what class and stuff makes a huge difference, and is subject to a great deal of, shall we say, manipulation and favoritism for certain groups that can result. Next, I would also agree that the use of averages is a well-known, statistical problem, because averages are hugely overweighted by those at the top. We see that in our own San Antonio income and wage data. We're supposedly at reasonable numbers in a lot of studies because they include the entire metropolitan area with surrounding suburban, even out to New Braunfels, wage structures that are much higher than those in the central parts of San Antonio. Really very much disadvantaging those people that live in those areas and recognizing their needs. So I think this interesting presentation, a whole lot more needs to be done. There are totally different ways to set up rates that protect users in low-income groups that are needy, ways that protect CPS infrastructure, but greatly incentivize conservation, whereas right now, as board member Ed Kelly loves to say, CPS has to sell energy to make money. Well, that's in the current rate structure, yes, but that needs to change. The structures can exist, they do exist, to have a protected infrastructure and business while incentivizing conservation. Los Angeles and other communities around the country are doing that. We need to change this model completely. Thank you.
I think that concludes our citizens. Is that right, Ann?
Yes, sir.
Okay, if I hear no other comments, we're adjourned. See you in a couple of weeks. Please look forward to our communication on the working groups. I hope I can get folks to engage on those. Thank you very much. Appreciate everything. Chad, great job. Please thank your group. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone. Stay safe.